Nebraska Governor Jim Pillen promising to veto a bill passed by lawmakers today.
LB 307 would allow safe syringe exchange programs in Nebraska. It passed in a 30-7 vote today, with 6 senators not voting. To override a veto, it needs the support of 30 senators, meaning everyone who voted in favor today will need to do so again for it to become law. The legislation introduced by Omaha Senator Megan Hunt is aimed at helping communities control the spread of diseases like HIV. It does not require counties or cities to adopt a safe syringe program. It just allows them to create one.
In a statement to 6 News, Governor Pillen's office raised concerns about how the bill is written, saying, quote, if the legislature is interested in lowering the transmission of HIV and drug usage, there are other avenues that would not result in an increased loss of life, end quote. And we have the full statement at WOWT.com.